Hello and welcome to episode 197 of the Sasuga podcast. In this episode, it's all about communication. Ready? Here we go. You're listening to the Sasuga podcast, and you're about to discover how to excel in your work without being exhausted through practical techniques that you can start using right now. I'm your host, Helen Iwata, a bilingual Brit with a 3-decade career in Tokyo. I'm an award-winning women's success and business communication coach, speaker, writer, wife, and mother. Every week here on the show, I share my personal stories and favorite techniques around the 4 phases of the Sasuga success cycle, around self-care, planning, communication, and productivity, to help you enjoy more success and less stress. You'll also have the chance to listen in on heartfelt and eye-opening conversations with inspiring guests and hear answers to your questions to help you use your expertise, time, and energy better, and quite simply to bring more joy into your work and life. This is the Sasuga podcast. Hello, lovely listener. How are you doing? I want to start with 2 shout-outs today, and the first is the fabulous Mari Ono, who I want to thank for recommending the Sasuga podcast. She sent me this audio message.
So I was talking with one of my mentees yesterday, and she really liked your podcast. I actually introduced it to her last month, and apparently she has been listening through a lot of episodes. She was mentioning a lot of content from your topics that was mentioned through the podcasts. So apparently she's listening to a lot, and she was mentioning how it really helps her also, not only with the content, but also with her English hearing practice or listening practice. So thank you.
And the second shout out is for Barack, who sent me a message saying, just listened to you on the Scaling Japan podcast and just wanted to say what a great listen it was. Tons of useful information. The trust formula in particular was an eye-opener. Your genuinity and personality positively radiated through my headphones, and I felt like I had to send you a message to show my appreciation. I'll make sure I listen to your own podcast from now on as well. Well, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to Tyson Bettino, who is the host of the Scaling Japan podcast, for inviting me to speak about growing your business through word of mouth. And that's episode 16 of the Scaling Japan podcast. And we'll link to that in the show notes. Okay, so today is our second compilation episode in the run-up to the 200th episode of the Sasuga podcast, which will be out on November 7th, that's 2022. And I've prepared a 3-part series to remind you of top tips from our most popular episodes on the topics of confidence and positivity, communication, and productivity. And in case you didn't absorb them all the first time round, or you're a new listener, I'm sure you will love these. So confidence and positivity was episode 195, and that's also linked in the show notes. So today, I'm going to introduce tips from our 5 most popular episodes on communication. These are related to phase 3 of the Sasuga success cycle, communicate your ideas. And this is all about presentation skills, meeting facilitation, and influencing. It's really anything to do with communication. And I know this is a very important topic for many Sasuga podcast listeners. You may find that you can grab these tips and run with them, or you may like to listen to the whole episode for the ones that are most meaningful for you. Again, linked in the show notes. Lots and lots of links in the show notes. So I do hope you find these useful, whether you are a new listener or you've been listening for some time. What was next? Oh yes, so I said you'll find the links in the show notes and also in this week's edition of my weekly newsletter of practical techniques, stories and resources. That's Sasuga Tips for You. And if you're not already a regular reader, you can easily subscribe at sasugacommunications.com/subscribe. Okay, so you may have heard that I'm increasingly becoming known as the less effort, more impact coach. These days, my focus is on helping overworking women in Japan and beyond to take care of their physical, mental, and emotional well-being and to expand their professional expertise so that they can enjoy doing great work without sacrificing their personal lives. But before I became obsessed with women's success, for years I was known as the communication expert. And this started from my 10 years with McKinsey Japan, where I trained consultants as well as their clients in skills such as listening, questioning, presentations, meeting facilitation, influencing, and of course, that old favorite, logical thinking. After I left the management consulting firm and set up my own business, which was actually the very next day, I became the go-to expert for multiple multinationals in Japan to design and lead their communication training programs. And I've coached top global executives one-on-one, as well as business leaders in Tokyo University's Executive Management Program. I won the 2017 Waseda University Teaching Award for my Strategic Thinking and Communication MBA course, and I'm a TEDx speaker and coach. So you can imagine that I know quite a lot about communication. And in past episodes of the Sasuga podcast, I've shared with you many of the most practical communication techniques that I've learned over my 3-decade career. And these are skills that my clients enjoy tremendous success with too. So now in the run-up to celebrating episode 200 of the Sasuga podcast on November 7th, 2022, as I've mentioned, I have compiled a whopping 23 top tips from 5 communication-focused episodes to help you improve your communication skills for meetings, presentations, and networking events in particular. So in this episode, you will hear 2 structures to sound clear, concise, and convincing in your English meetings and presentations, 6 techniques to get others to speak in meetings, 4 questions to ask yourself to help difficult conversations go more smoothly and for you to feel better, and 6 questions to make small talk easier, and finally 5 ways to talk to colleagues depending on their particular preferences. All right, so let's dive straight in with episode 166, which was This Drives Your Global Colleagues Crazy. So my Japanese clients in global organizations are very often concerned that they can't convey what they want to say clearly in English meetings and presentations. And they usually think it's an English language problem and that they need to study English harder, get their grammar right, and expand their vocabulary. Interestingly, I rarely hear non-Japanese business leaders complaining about the English capability of their Japanese colleagues. Let me say that again. I rarely hear, maybe even never, I'm just trying to think, have I actually even heard this? Non-Japanese business leaders complaining about the English capability of their Japanese colleagues. But I do hear from them that they're frustrated when their colleagues fail to be concise and get to the point in their communication. So to sound clear, concise, and convincing in your English meetings and presentations, and by the way, this also applies if you're a native speaker of English, I recommend 2 structures, the pyramid structure and the story structure. And in episode 166, if you're not so familiar with these, I go into detail of what these are and when to use them depending on your audience. Again, linked in the show notes. So following on from the struggle of speaking up clearly and confidently yourself comes getting others to speak up. You may have faced this challenge, especially if you've ever led a meeting in Japan. So the next topic is from episode 117, how to get others to speak in meetings. So it's really simply a matter of setting some guidelines and helping people to feel comfortable when you speak. And you can use these tips in any meeting situation, whether in person or online. So, first of all, related to setting clear guidelines and expectations. So what's important here is to get agreement on 3 points: your goals for the meeting, the roles of the people in the meeting, and the ways that you will proceed in the meeting, such as how people will share information or opinions, how you'll narrow down ideas, how you'll make decisions, and those things. There are so many different ways to run meetings, and if people aren't clear on the ways and expectations, they're less likely to speak up. And secondly, create a supportive environment. So I'm sure you recognize that many people hesitate to speak up because they're concerned about saying the wrong thing or what people might think of them. And there are many ways that you can create a supportive environment. So just 3 that you can easily start to use are, number 1, listen when people do speak up. Very often as a facilitator, if you're not so familiar with it, you may feel nervous and you just want to move ahead. It's important to really listen to what people say. Number 2, smile, except of course when it's a serious topic. And number 3 is appreciate, thank people when they ask questions or make comments. And if you want to know more about facilitation skills, if you read Japanese, I do recommend chapter 4 of my book, Eigo no Shigoto Jutsu. It's available in the paper copy and also it's on Kindle. Now, sometimes it's not a meeting with a group of people, but you need to have a difficult conversation with a colleague or a client. So our next set of tips is from episode 149, to make your difficult conversations easier. So, let me ask you, have you had any difficult conversations recently? Then you probably weren't looking forward to it. Maybe you were even a little bit scared. And this usually comes down to 2 things. Number 1, you don't want to upset the other person. Number 2, you're concerned what they will think of you. Well, guess what? No matter how much you dread the situation, that is not going to change how upset they are or what they think of you. In fact, the more you worry, the worse it's likely to go. So instead of stressing yourself about an upcoming difficult conversation, you can use specific strategies and techniques to help the conversation go more smoothly and for you to feel better. So ask yourself these 4 questions. Number 1, what is the other person's understanding? Number 2, how are they likely to react? Number 3, what are their values? What's important for them? And number 4, what is their communication style? And in episode 149, I explain these in more detail, and I also talk about how to handle emotions. That's both yours and theirs, and typical mistakes that make difficult conversations harder than they need to be. Go to the show notes and click the link if you would like to listen to more on that topic. So next, here's another area that many consider a difficult conversation. It's making small talk. And as networking events are starting up again, you may find this especially useful. We're about halfway through this episode, and the fact that you're listening to this topic suggests that communication is important for you. If that's the case, have you already downloaded my quick guide, 8 essential phrases for clear, confident English presentations? Business English coach Emi Onishi said about this guide, I truly enjoyed reading through the material. I got intrigued by the first tip because I know some people really do this. Helen is teaching very useful and practical phrases that you can start using right away. They will definitely level up your presentations. And if you haven't got yours yet, you can easily get started right now at sasugacommunications.com/English phrases. That's all one word, English phrases. Again, linked in the show notes. Okay, back to this episode. So episode 126 was how do I make small talk? The secret is to ask about the other person more than talking about yourself or general topics. Dale Carnegie said, talk to someone about themselves and they'll listen for hours. When you think of it this way, you really don't have to worry about coming up with impressive conversation topics. You can create a general list of questions to use as a starting point and then notice what the person seems most interested in, what they're interested in talking about as well, such as, does your name have a special meaning? Where are you from? Where are you living now? Are you working? How do you like to spend your time? What's new and exciting in your life? That's one of my favorites. I talk more about communicating effectively at networking events, including how to improve your listening skills in episode 126 in the show notes. And finally, the more you can improve relationships, the better your communication is going to be. And the more you improve your communication, the better your relationships are going to be. So have you heard of the book, The 5 Love Languages from Dr. Gary Chapman? That was the topic for episode 131. And those 5 love languages are words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, and physical touch. And in episode 131, I introduce each of these and talk about how you can use them for better relationships at work, not just with loved ones. So today we talked about 2 structures to sound clear, concise, and convincing in your English meetings and presentations. 6 techniques to get others to speak in meetings. 4 questions to ask yourself to help difficult conversations go more smoothly and for you to feel better. 6 questions to make small talk easier, and 5 love languages for better relationships and communication at work. That's 23 tips in total. So what was most meaningful for you in this episode of the Sasuga podcast? I would love to read your comments on any of my social media posts. I'm on Instagram at Helen Iwata or LinkedIn as Helen Iwata. You can find today's show notes at sasugacommunications.com/197. Rather extensive show notes. Lots and lots of links in there. So I really strongly recommend that you consider what has been most important for you. Go and follow up by checking those links. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you being here. It amazes me to think that every week so many of you are listening to the Sasuga podcast, and I'm so excited that we've got episode 200 coming up. That's really going to be a great one, by the way. Make it a brilliant, expertly communicated, and joyful day. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Sasuga podcast. Wow, the fact that you listened all the way to the end here tells me how committed you are to your personal and professional development. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to tell your friends or colleagues about the Sasuga podcast. Spread the tips and the joy. Help to make everybody's lives better. And you may even like to rate and review the Sasuga podcast in your favorite podcast player to help others find it. And if you'd like to hear more from me, be sure you're regularly reading my free weekly newsletter, Sasuga Tips for You. I'll send you practical techniques, resources, and inspiration every Tuesday in English and Japanese. Just go to sasugacommunications.com/subscribe to subscribe. And I look forward to supporting you.